Angelica simply couldn't understand why she, whose instantaneous techniques were unmatched in the world, couldn't even defeat a lowly adventurer today. Worse, the male protagonist suspected her of having secured her position in the Knight's Order through backdoor connections. Little did she know that to Rick, her movements appeared as slow as a snail's. Rick couldn't help but wonder if he might actually be stronger after all, which was understandable given that his masters were the strongest adventurers on the continent, and the training he had undergone was nothing short of hellish. The constant belittlement from his masters led him to believe that they represented only the starting point of combat power on the continent. After successfully graduating, Rick planned to register his level at the Adventurers Guild. He learned that to obtain an adventurer's identity, he would need to pass a test. No sooner had he completed the procedures than a drunkard approached the front desk, causing trouble. With a spirit of helping others, Rick quickly patted the man's chest to sober him up, and sure enough, the man immediately quieted down, even frothing at the mouth in gratitude to Rick. Seeing that the situation was getting out of hand, Rick quickly smoothed things over by claiming he had been confused by the alcohol and advised the onlookers not to drink counterfeit alcohol like he had. After obtaining his examination slip, when Elfelt, his master, inquired about his progress, Rick, distractedly staring at a woman with large breasts, gave irrelevant answers. Unbeknownst to Rick, the front desk was in chaos by then. His handprint had even left an imprint on a steel armor. Moreover, someone recognized the drunk man's identity. He was an A-class criminal recently wanted by the authorities. Soon, the first magic test began. Most participants were above level D, but when it was Rick's turn, everyone laughed at him. However, unbeknownst to them, as Rick left, the crystal ball cracked. The examiner, however, didn't care, assuming it was normal wear and tear. Then came the strength test, where the examiner scored participants based on the damage they inflicted on slime-filled punching bags. Rick was initially afraid, having trained with a golden slime as hard as dragon's teeth. Soon, a wealthy heir took the stage, hailed by all as a prodigious genius. Rick was curious about his strength. The heir struck a supremely cliched pose, drawing everyone's attention. However, when he launched a fireball, though it was very small, it received lavish praise from the audience. Rick, knowing that his lowly master could unleash fireballs not only larger, but also of nation-destroying power, began to suspect that the wealthy heir was deliberately suppressing his power. If so, he truly was a genius. When it was Rick's turn, seeing that he was a 30-year-old newbie adventurer and considering his poor magic test results, the examiner advised Rick to give up on becoming an adventurer. Rick was almost persuaded to quit, but remembering his years of effort, he assumed his strongest attack posture and smashed the punching bag. Despite the wealthy heir's displeasure, he restrained himself and proceeded to the next test. Unexpectedly, Rick not only easily defended against a 4th-tier magic attack, but also declared his intention to challenge a 5th-tier spell. Hearing this, the examiner became furious, feeling underestimated, and launched a powerful attack. As expected, the 5th-tier spell shattered the defensive barrier, but Rick remained completely unharmed. The Knight Captain's attention was captured by the tremendous uproar. Learning that Rick not only effortlessly blocked a 5th-tier magic spell, but also shattered a slime-filled punching bag with his bare hands, the Knight Captain became interested. After all the tests were completed, the wealthy heir came to cause trouble again. Annoyed by Rick stealing the spotlight all day, he was not pleased, but he wasn't foolish either. He directly brought in his sister Angelica, a 2nd-class knight of the kingdom, planning to teach Rick a lesson. Angelica casually threw her glove at Rick as a challenge for a duel. Rick, mistaking the glove for a free gift, was unaware that picking up the glove in the kingdom meant accepting the duel. With no choice, Rick followed her to the duel arena. As per tradition, both duelists could make a victory demand. Angelica demanded that the loser serve the winner until death, which seemed like an easy condition. However, Rick panicked upon hearing 2nd-class knight, comparable to a B-class adventurer, and even vomited on the spot, thinking he was just an F-class weakling. Encouraged by Elfelt, Rick gathered himself to face the duel. Angelica planned to intimidate Rick right from the start, so she buffed herself and launched her attack, instantly slicing through the iron bars behind her. Seeing Rick's shocked expression, she thought her move had intimidated him, but Rick was only rubbing his eyes in disbelief. When she attacked again, Rick found it too slow. Is this the Night Order's strength? He wondered. Unable to believe it, as her speed was comparable to a first-class knight, Angelica accelerated and executed her fastest sword technique. To Rick, however, it still seemed as slow as a snail. Just then, Angelica unexpectedly kicked a stone, causing her body to spin out uncontrollably like a windmill. This disorderly attack made Rick dismiss his thoughts of being strong. To ease the awkwardness, Angelica, trying to maintain composure, praised Rick for evading even such an attack and declared she would get serious now. She then used her tri-foot kill, a move she could only perform 3 times. Rick easily dodged it again. Angelica panicked. The move was too draining, but determined not to lose the duel, she used it again, only to be dodged once more. With only one chance left, she went all in. But another mishap occurred. A stone on the ground tripped her, causing her to fly low across the ground. Rick, thinking she was aiming for a crippling blow, stopped her with a punch, but accidentally used too much force, creating a huge crater. Angelica was dumbfounded, realizing she might have been knocked out if not for the trip. Rick regretted that his punch had deviated again. Terrified, Angelica asked who he was. Rick replied that he was just the worst F-class adventurer, a claim she couldn't believe. With no choice but to continue the duel, Rick was ready to fight, but for her own safety, Angelica quickly surrendered. As Rick was still in shock, she turned and left swiftly. But Rick wasn't foolish. "What about the stakes we agreed on?" he reminded. Angelica, realizing her predicament, turned pale and ran off quickly. That might have been the fastest she moved today. The novice Uncle Rick never expected that he would accidentally join the legendary team of adventurers, only to live a life like hell every day. After training desperately for 2.5 years, he unknowingly became the strongest S-rank adventurer on the surface. To him, mighty dragons were like toys. However, because he had never left the mountain during his training and was often ridiculed by his masters, Rick always thought he was still weak. A simple level 1 exam made Rick extremely nervous, only because Elfelt had once said that failing the exam would mean doubling the training workload upon returning, which was no different from a death sentence. Fortunately, he successfully passed the first stage of the assessment, and his hanging heart was finally able to relax. Just as he was preparing to leave, a pungent smell suddenly filled the air. A self-proclaimed handsome man named Raster approached to flirt with Elfelt. He was the eldest son of Duke Diarmoit, and the brother of Fried and Angelica, whom Rick had encountered earlier. Rick initially thought Raster was also a candidate and tried to greet him, but was met with a look of utter disdain. Raster then took Elfelt by the hand, started spouting cheesy love lines, and even proposed to make her his second wife. At this, Elfelt's eyes instantly filled with murderous intent. Seeing trouble, Rick quickly interrupted Raster, claiming that Elfelt was his girlfriend and that he couldn't just stand by. Raster, dismissive, laughed when he saw Rick's exam certificate. He couldn't help but mock Rick, noting that at Rick's age, he was still stuck at F rank, whereas he himself had advanced to E rank at the age of 14 and was now not only an A rank adventurer, but also the examiner for the second stage mock battle. Despite this, Elfelt still rejected his invitation. Angered and embarrassed, Raster vowed that if he became Rick's examiner in the second stage, he would show Elfelt the gap in strength between them, convinced that she would surely change her mind. At this point, Rick was speechless and prayed that he wouldn't encounter Raster. Suddenly, he felt a pressure on his arm and realized that Elfelt had been holding on to him the whole time. He also apologized to Elfelt for claiming she was his girlfriend without her consent, but she seemed quite happy with it. Unbeknownst to them, once Raster returned, Fried and Angelica complained to their brother about being bullied by Rick, swearing to make Rick understand the consequences of angering the nobility. The next day, as the mock battle was about to begin, Rick was extremely anxious, worried about actually facing Raster as the examiner. Then, a middle-aged man suddenly appeared with good news. His name was Lynx, and he was assigned as Rick's examiner for the mock battle. Hearing this, Rick was overjoyed. Lynx had sought out Rick after hearing about his determination, which greatly inspired him as a fellow middle-aged adventurer who had also started his career at the age of 24, harboring similar dreams. Although it took him 20 years to barely reach B rank. Even so, determined to climb to A rank to realize his dream, Rick found that Lynx, despite his age, was still fighting with a fiery passion, seeming like a friend with similar aspirations. Unbeknownst to them, their conversation was fully overheard by Raster, who was hiding nearby. When they reached the resting room, Rick thought he was lucky this time. But then, a staff member brought dire news. The originally assigned examiner, Lynx, had suddenly fallen ill, and Raster would be taking over as the examiner. This news terrified Rick so much that he choked. Other candidates also murmured complaints, because Raster, a noble from a distinguished family, had reached A rank at just 17 years old, not only hailed as a genius, but also known as the F-rank Terminator. It was rumored that he enjoyed tormenting the candidates he set his sights on each year. Hearing this, Rick paced nervously back and forth, afraid of being targeted by such a narrow-minded person, fearing the inhumane training that awaited him if he failed. Rick's lack of confidence stemmed from his late start compared to others, and his efforts along the way were often dismissed by others. Seeing this, Elfelt comforted him, saying that if one's confidence could be shaken by the words of others, conversely, it could also be stimulated by the words of others. Elfelt firmly believed that Rick was strong and would definitely pass the exam. At that moment, their conversation was interrupted. Freed, fully disguised, sweet-talked Rick, falsely offering to divine his fortune for free. Rick, unsuspecting, thought it would be a good omen before the mock battle. However, Elfelt felt something was off. The moment Rick sat down, a teleportation magic circle appeared on the stool. Before she could stop him, Rick was transported somewhere else. The next second, Elfelt reprimanded Freed. Meanwhile, Rick was transported outside the examination venue, confused and lost, when suddenly a group of people surrounded him. They were Raster's personal guard, intending to prevent Rick from participating in the exam. All present were adventurers of B rank and above. If Rick failed because of this, it would be embarrassing. At that moment, a voice was heard from afar. Rick's masters suddenly appeared. Rick was about to explain when he saw the minions behind him, so he lied, claiming they were just sparring before the exam. His bald master found this amusing and immediately offered to help. Rick panicked at once, urging the butler to lead people to flee, afraid they would all die here. But the butler, disdainful, immediately ordered them to be killed. However, the bloodbath Rick imagined did not occur. Instead, weapons shattered all over the ground. This infuriated the man, who then threw his weapon and violently attacked with his fists, only for his punch to be easily caught by the bald master. The next second, his palm was crushingly fractured, leaving the man in immense shock and fear. However, what was even more unexpected was that the opponent merely chanted for a moment, and the originally shattered palm was instantly healed. The bald master patiently instructed the weakling, telling him not to focus solely on strengthening his arms, but to always be aware that the body functions as a whole. This scene made the butler sweat profusely, and he seemed to faintly guess the identity of the other party. In fact, Master Mizet knew at a glance that they were here to cause trouble and immediately offered to resolve the situation peacefully for Rick. He then pulled out an American-style katana and started firing without a word, emptying the magazine and stunning Rick. Seeing the situation worsen, the man instantly took a little girl hostage. Upon seeing this, Rick urged the man to let her go quickly. However, the weakling was not likely to listen to reason, and she cast a high-level magic spell. At this moment, the butler also understood the identities of the group. The little girl, only 10 years old, was known as the strongest genius magician vampire in history. Mizet was a mix of dwarf and elf, possessing technology that seemed millennia ahead. The bald orc, both a monstrous creature of strength and possessing wisdom, along with the others, were not only the world's strongest S-rank adventurers, but also members of the legendary Orichalcum Fist squad. The butler never expected to see them with his own eyes one day, and immediately decided to retire, returning to the countryside to live out his life peacefully farming. Rick said he needed to go back and try hard on the exam and hurried away. At the same time, Freed was smug, believing that Rick, having been teleported away, could not safely return, especially with the family guard waiting for him. But unexpectedly, Rick suddenly appeared. Elfelt tossed Freed aside like trash. Just then, Lynx, weakened, walked over. From his mouth, Rick learned that Raster wanted to be Rick's examiner so badly that he had knocked him down deliberately, even asking about his own dreams. When he revealed his dream of building a school for aspiring adventurers in his remote hometown, he was brutally beaten and mocked, then locked up in a dark room. Although resentful, he could not refute Raster's words. He advised Rick to better give up on the exam, as the other party would definitely use all means to torment him. However, Rick interrupted him, insisting, "It's never too late to try new things, no matter how old one is." At that moment, Rick, extremely angered, immediately headed to the exam venue to teach Raster a lesson. Seeing his own guards shaking, Raster realized Rick had arrived. He had wanted Rick to lose his qualifications, to feel a devastating sense of powerlessness. But now that Rick had chosen to take the exam, he was ready to ruthlessly trample on his boring efforts and passion, to show him a fear that would make even hell pale in comparison. But Rick was not someone to be trifled with. Raster could never have imagined that his proudly wielded super-tier magic would be so weak in front of Rick. Rick, who was just a lowly F-rank middle-aged man, somehow managed to make Raster, an elite, flee in panic. Little did anyone know, Rick might appear as an F-rank on the surface, but under his monstrously strong master, he had trained to the death for 2.5 years, elevating his strength to that of the strongest S-rank adventurer on the surface. However, due to frequent mocking by his masters, Rick always thought he was still weak, despite being able to easily shatter a 2.5-ton boulder, a feat even an F-rank adventurer could accomplish. Undeterred, Rick decided to step into the E-rank promotion exam, determined to teach Raster a lesson for trampling on others' dreams. Alika, witnessing this, was very worried because she had heard that Raster liked to use his strength to utterly crush the examinees. However, the masters were not worried at all. Seeing Rick's arrival, Raster did not expect that his opponent could escape from his personal guard. If so, he was ready to crush Rick's boring efforts and passion. But before that, Rick curiously asked Raster why he chose to be an adventurer, only to find Raster's disdain for adventurers. Being a noble with high innate talent, Raster viewed adventuring merely as a way to increase his market value, planning to resign at any convenient reason. However, facing his own launched magic, Rick did not move, thinking he was frightened. Unknown to Raster, Rick was extremely angry after hearing his words, but remembered what Elfelt had told him before the exam, to stay absolutely calm and closely observe his opponent. Although he did not understand Elfelt's intent, he trusted her judgment. Then Raster unleashed a third-tier magic, intending to crush Rick's dreams in one blow. But what he never expected was that Rick, with just his physical body, could resist the third-tier magic unscathed, shocking Elisa. But Master told her not to worry too much. The magical power of adventurers is very special. If not strengthened before the age of 20, it cannot grow later on. Rick began adventuring at 30, making his magical power minuscule. Therefore, his bald master subjected him to inhuman physical training, each leg weighed down with 100 kilograms, desperately crossing a den filled with carnivorous, magical beasts. After 2.5 years of training, Rick had already reached the S-rank realm, although he himself did not realize it. Meanwhile, Raster never thought that the S-rank old man he never took seriously could, with just his physical strength, effortlessly block the magic he was so proud of. Thinking Rick was just a durable punching bag, he aimed to completely defeat him in his own domain. However, Rick punched him back, finally understanding the meaning behind Elfelt's words. Raster, relying on his innate talent, had never truly studied magic. Although his magical power was immense, beyond that, he was a mess. Faced with someone who only depleted his own talents, it seemed impossible to lose. Seeing Rick suddenly full of confidence, Raster was arrogantly proud, thinking Rick had just accidentally caught the timing to neutralize the attack. This time, his fully chanted magic's explosive power would surely be too much for him to handle, but Rick simply blocked it with one hand. Seeing this, Raster lunged at Rick, planning a sneak attack. Unexpectedly, Rick countered with a punch. Raster was completely taken aback. He had not anticipated that Rick was hiding his true strength, which seemed to be beyond E-rank. Meanwhile, mockingly saying that Rick was really lucky. However, Rick retorted that what he had used was not even magic, but mere physical control, yet its precision far surpassed your enhanced magic. Raster was skeptical. With Rick's meager amount of magical power and at his age, how could he possibly become so strong in just 2.5 years? Hearing this, Rick trembled slightly. His master had once left him in a dragon's nest, not allowing him to leave until he defeated the dragon, enduring bombing under 200 kilograms of weight and facing inhumane torture, repeatedly breaking and repairing, which drastically transformed Rick's body. Although Rick said this, Raster didn't believe him at all. Even if there was such harsh training, what did he rely on to keep going? Without hesitation, Rick said, to become an adventurer and defeat the world's strongest magical creature, Kaiser Yalu. This made Raster laugh out loud because, in everyone's impression, Kaiser Yalu was just a monster from storybooks. But little did they know, this ultimate magical creature really existed and was their ultimate goal. Seeing this, Raster didn't bother listening to Rick's nonsense and decided to end things with Rick for good. He casually released a 7th-tier magic to bind and restrain Rick, followed by an 8th-tier magic. Watching the tree man appear, Rick was not at all flustered and concentrated all his energy in his hand. However, Raster mocked him, saying, "A mere 1st-tier chi punch, and you think it can shake the human pinnacle of 8th-tier magic?" But what Raster didn't know was that Rick's chi punch had been practiced 100 million times over 2.5 years. Although physically impossible, it could be achieved with special space-time magic, and Rick achieved it through his indomitable will. Of course, Raster wouldn't believe it and didn't plan to let Rick continue boasting. With his strongest strike, he intended to completely shatter Rick and the middle-aged examiner's dreams. The two forces collided violently. Rick continued to exert force, but Raster's tree man began to crumble. With Rick's shout, the 8th-tier magic was ultimately shattered. The onlookers couldn't believe it. Rick, a candidate, had defeated an A-rank examiner. Afterwards, Rick returned to the resting room to find his masters waiting for him. After this battle, he realized he really had become stronger and was very thankful for his master's help and training. Just then, a bruised Raster walked in. Although Raster's previous actions had been excessive, Rick still gave him advice. The reason he lost was because he had honed his techniques to perfection. He advised Raster to seriously study a single magic. Whether Raster took the advice was unknown, but as he left, he dropped a harsh word, saying that next time when Rick took the upgrading exam and he was his examiner again, he would definitely win. As evening approached, the announcements for those who passed the E-rank exam were gradually broadcasted. But Elfelt noticed a drastic change in Rick's mindset. He seemed to have remembered a lot of things. Rick had been identified as possessing a special skill from a young age, but he had not awakened it for 30 years. He had resigned himself to never becoming an adventurer. However, when faced with a dragon, he unexpectedly awakened his special skill. With one arm, he blocked the dragon's attack and then unleashed a surprising burst of power, shocking Elfelt, who was nearby. At that moment, Rick was exhilarated and decided to use the dragon as practice. He effortlessly blocked the dragon's attacks with a barrier and then counterattacked, instantly slaying the dragon with a dazzling laser. Originally, after defeating Raster, Rick remembered being told in his early childhood that he possessed a special skill, which excited him immensely. He had looked forward to awakening this special skill every day, but decades passed. The dream of becoming an adventurer had faded, and Rick had become a desk clerk at the Adventurers Guild, dealing with endless social obligations and mundane tasks. However, one night, after drinking with his boss until midnight, Rick encountered a maid, Elfelt, on his way home. Sensing danger, he instinctively protected her, but Elfelt, who was not at all afraid of the monster, killed it immediately. During a casual conversation afterward, Rick discovered that Elfelt was an S-rank adventurer, a level he never thought he'd encounter in his lifetime. Rick promptly asked her out to dinner, half expecting her to refuse, but she agreed right away, which thrilled Rick immensely. The next day, Rick felt as if he had won a big prize and was extremely excited. He barely made it through the workday, with his mind full of the upcoming date with Elfelt. However, many monsters suddenly appeared in the town. When he rushed to the scene, he found that Elfelt had already taken action. She quickly dispatched a large number of monsters, but suddenly, terrifying memories from her childhood surfaced in her mind. She realized that there must be a powerful dragon nearby, because her body showed symptoms similar to trauma. Whenever she sensed the dragon's magic, she lost her ability to fight. 3 B-rank adventurers from the guild came to help, but they were no match for the dragon. Just when everyone was in despair, Rick stepped forward alone and faced the dragon. The next second, the dragon slapped him to the ground. It seemed certain that his small frame would not survive, but Rick, bearing the dragon's hit, stood up, visibly radiating magic power. The awakened Rick, thrilled with his new power, easily killed the dragon with a single strike. People watched his victorious silhouette, somewhat at a loss. The man could never have imagined that a candidate who had just advanced to E-rank adventurer would have 4 S-rank masters. One was a seemingly innocent little lowly, whose casual spells were comparable to 6th-tier magic. Another, thought to be a maid hired for money, could lift monsters weighing several tons with one hand alone. Then there was a seemingly careless blonde, whose newly invented prototype could instantly destroy everything, and a book-loving orc who could kill an A-rank dragon with a single punch. This made him even more regretful of his own foolishness. It was not long before he learned that Rick had passed the E-rank adventurer exam. To celebrate, Lynx wanted to have a drink with him and meet Rick's masters. However, he didn't realize that this casual mention would nearly send him to the Ghost Gate. He didn't understand why Rick insisted he come fully armed. Soon, he arrived at an area enveloped in thick fog. After confirming several times that this was Rick's home, he decided to knock on the door. He walked directly to a smaller side door, only to be shocked to see Rick coming out of an unreasonably large door. What made him even more curious was that he hadn't seen any monsters along the way. If there was no danger, why did he need to be fully armed? Just as he voiced this question, Rick said it was so that he wouldn't need to be put in a coffin. At that moment, Rick opened the house's main door, and a maid was already waiting inside. Lynx didn't pay much attention to this, simply assuming Rick's family was wealthy. But just then, Drockwell called out to Rick and unleashed a spell of 6th-tier power. Rick deflected the attack. It was only when Rick addressed Drockwell as senior that Lynx realized this was one of Rick's masters, and their earlier action was just their usual play. But they shouldn't have been playing inside the house. Upon hearing Elfelt mention that the repair costs would be deducted from Drockwell's meal expenses, Drockwell collapsed in dismay. Later, to avoid further trouble from Drockwell, Rick decided to accompany her for a while and let Lynx explore on his own, because Elfelt merely let him roam freely and walked away, but such a large place required a guide. Just as he was about to wait for Rick to return, he suddenly saw a blonde outside assembling a strange weapon. Curiosity got the better of him, and he started inquiring. Fortunately, Mizette already knew he was Rick's friend and patiently explained that this was his latest invention. Rather than just listening, it was better to try it out. After explaining how to use it, Mizette found him a target for shooting. The moment he pulled the trigger, the missile caused astonishing damage, and the strong recoil knocked him down. Realizing Mizette was not to be trifled with, Lynx dared not wander further. But as he returned the same way, he suddenly discovered an orc reading a book inside the house. This contradictory scene instantly piqued his curiosity again. Upon learning that the orc was another of Rick's masters, he immediately asked if he could also receive some guidance. This also made Ashork pause for a moment, because Lynx's gaze reminded him of Rick. After a brief consideration, he decided to give it a try. They went to a cliff, where the training method was too much for Lynx to handle. Just when he thought he was going to die, he was caught by something soft. But then he realized that this was all just preparation for their dinner tonight, which made him instantly realize that everyone in Rick's family should not be underestimated. Telling himself the reason he ended up here was because Ashork had pushed him off the cliff, Lynx was surprised to find that Elfelt seemed to treat it as normal, since Ashork had caused Rick's death the most times so far. While Lynx was still confused, Ashork came over to his side. After searching for a long time, Ashork found Lynx in such a place and took him for training again. Fortunately for Lynx, he still managed to survive. Seeing his miserable state, Rick also sympathized with him, knowing all too well the terror of his masters. However, after understanding everything, Lynx gradually calmed down. During dinner, he became curious about Rick's inherent skills. He asked about them, but it was as if he hadn't asked at all. However, Ashork explaining that Rick's skills are conditionally activated, meaning he cannot activate them on his own, knowing that even without skills, Rick had already reached the S-rank level. One could imagine how powerful he would be once activated. Ashok was confident that Rick could surpass them and be the key to defeating the strongest monster, Kaiser. Just when Lynx was a bit dumbfounded, Ashok suddenly asked him if he had ever heard of the 6 orbs. The so-called 6 orbs are the keys to unlocking the sleeping place of Kaiser, and now was the time when they were active. Although Lynx was shocked to hear this, since Kaiser is a part of the Grand Legends, he had some clues about the 6 orbs. After telling everyone the location, they arrived at the Adventurers Guild early the next morning. However, to their surprise, the guild leader was very rigid, requiring 4 people to take on a quest. Just as they were worrying about what to do, Lynx suddenly saw Ray, who had just come to work. He remembered Ray saying that she wanted to experience a high-risk task. Now the opportunity had come. Although it suited Ray's intentions, she couldn't tell that the 3 people in front of her were experts. But then she thought that this was a great opportunity to show her skills. After agreeing on the spot, she quickly set off with the 3 of them, just as she had expected. She felt that this task was not dangerous at all, and perhaps it could even be a chance for her to showcase her abilities and make the guild leader see her in a new light. However, soon after arriving at their destination, Ray realized that her thoughts were gravely mistaken. She never expected that the 3 were planning to stir up trouble in a dragon's nest. Considering that even the weakest dragon is of A rank, and as the name suggests, there isn't just one in a nest, this was sheer overestimation of their abilities. Ray's worries annoyed Ashok, so he had Rick send her away. Ray agreed without hesitation, as staying there would mean certain death. However, what slightly infuriated her was why Rick wouldn't take everyone away together. Staying would clearly lead to a dead end. Then, what happened next completely exceeded her expectations. As a dragon fell dead before her, followed by a second and a third, dragons were being knocked out of the sky every second. But at that moment, one dragon set its sights on them. Ray immediately recognized that this was no ordinary beast, but one that even several A-rank adventurers couldn't defeat. Just as she thought of running away, to her surprise, Rick instead moved forward, seemingly marching towards his demise. She knew Rick was only E-rank, but when he told her it was okay for her to escape, she felt insulted, which made her decide to fight to the death. Ray was shocked when Rick, against all odds, knocked out the red dragon with a single punch. After returning, Ray could no longer focus on her job and decided to resign to become an adventurer like Rick. While the guild leader was at a loss for words, Rick had already returned home. Although they only found one of the 6 orbs on this trip, Huang Mao, as the technical expert of the team, could locate the positions of the other orbs through resonance. Discovering that the nearest one was in a major city nearby, they prepared to set off. What Rick didn't know was that at this very moment, Angelica was in that city.